but mainly here to talk about some of what I've observed and analyzed as part of my research into manual gesturing. Um, Sort of focused on the applied linguistic aspect of it as a communication strategy, and sort of there are notions tied to that that are interesting to me on a conceptual level, specifically in terms of focusing on the idiosyncratic and aspects of language, and how we might think of language planning. So, as a philosophical, one of these philosophical issues that I've been kind of provoked by, one of the primary things I've been interested in is this idea of concepts, where concepts exist, how do concepts come about, and I'm sort of troubled by traditional notions of concepts either existing in some kind of transcendental world, some kind of platonic form, kind of like numbers, right? When we talk about numbers, we say, where do numbers, are numbers real? Well, yes, numbers are real, but where do they exist? These sorts of like philosophical, metaphysical questions. And I've been troubled by the question itself. I've been troubled by this notion of either that or concepts existing somehow in the head, and stored in some kind of in memory, and then we can bring them out and use them. However, I'm still, we do talk about concepts. We're still interested in scientific concepts, social science concepts, political. We tend to package things into what we call concepts, and then use those as, like, say, heuristics, that in our everyday conversation as well. So my research is primarily interested in looking at the like embodied practices and more material practices of thinking. Just to give you like a quick example, for example, coming from an embodied perspective, say the origins of geometry, like Husserl, the philosopher Husserl kind of came up talking about the origins of geometry as being rooted in the practices of measurement and the tools that were used to measure things, and that the concepts of geometry kind of came about from there. So I'm rooted in a perspective of seeing that humans do things in the world, we make sense of the world, and from the things that we do and the way that we interact in the world, then we begin to abstract from that. From a gesture perspective, however, focused on how we do that in the hands. So let me see if I can. Oh, okay. So going from a sense of like concepts being this sort of static entities that we hold, I prefer to kind of think of it as conceptualization, a dynamic, activity-oriented process, and that concepts that when we come to understand things and what we think of as knowledge is more of an achievement of different enactive, ecological, and intersubjective sense making, how we interact in the world, and how we organize the things that we come across in the world with our bodies and the way that we attend to them. So again, these are things that are kind of abstract. So I want to get kind of focus on what we're going to be talking about. So I feel that gesture is a great place to do that. All right. So the plan for today, we'll be looking at kind of spoken expositions as the context for looking at concept building in the flesh, if you will, and specifically during spoken exposition, the kinds of gestures that come about as part of the analysis of an explanation. I do want to mention that we're honing in on what we might call depictive gestures. Some of you might call them iconic gestures that seem to be fashioned to appear like something. But I want to kind of loose, like this is like a loose taxonomy of this, because I'm more interested in the actual activity itself of exposition, and how there are many contingencies involved in that. So we'll look at that, just look at a preliminary example. I'll talk a little bit about what I mean by construal in this work, and why construal might be an interesting way of looking at what I'm talking about in terms of how gestures are used for concept building or concept analysis. We'll go through a few examples, probably 2 examples, maybe not the third one. We'll see if we have time. and then concluding remarks, and hopefully we'll have some time for questions. All right, so like I said, don't want to get too much into a taxonomy of gesturing, but definitely in this area of gesticulation, if we're going to talk about it from Kendon's continuum perspective, sort of idiosyncratic, spontaneous gestures that emerge from that are, during speaking or signing, that are kind of these seem to be spontaneously produced. And honing in on what Street calls the ecology of gesture, gestures that are part of an explanatory or descriptive activity that are part of bringing that activity into view. So it's we'll be looking at how people bring, something that's not in view, how they bring it into view with their gestures. And so we'll call those depictive gestures. Street calls them, he has his name, depiction by gesture, as having a specific sort of trajectory of how those come about, and certain features that are very specific to them. But for the sake of what I'm looking at, I'm interested just in depictive gestures as emerging from these explanatory episodes. So let's just get right to looking at basically what I'm talking about. Here we have a couple of, some students, they're in an explanation activity in a classroom setting, and one of them is tasked with explaining something to the other students. It's almost like something that we see in the classroom on a regular basis, and it's almost like a guessing game. The students then, they kind of have to guess what they're talking about. So we'll look at here, and so I've circled the student who we'll be looking at, and just pay attention to what she does with her hands.
I don't remember it. What I read is chemistry. I have a big cup. In this cup, I pour some water. This water is sugary water. Sugary water. Sweet water. Sweet water. Yes. And then we put a small cup. Small cup. Yes, small cup. Put a small cup into the big cup. In the small cup, we have another sweet water.
Okay, so here we have an episode of depiction. We have a speaker who is in a activity of explaining something, and she uses her hands as part of that explanation. So the question that I'm interested in is, why these particular features? What is it about the explanation that motivates her to articulate her hands in this specific way? So without getting into too many theoretical things about this, we can immediately begin to make a description of what's going on here. So we know that she's articulating verbally part of the explanation. So she first introduces it as the topic. She topicalizes it by saying it's a chemistry phenomenon. And then she begins to talk about what is involved in this chemistry phenomenon, right? So she depicts a cup, right, a big cup, but then she does so, as you can see, well, see, here I am gesturing, but you can't see, I don't know if you can see my gesturing at all. But so we'll, if you look at, let's see, I don't even have a pointer here. Okay, so things to note for other talks. In the first example, we see that she puts her hands into a specific articulation to depict a cup. But then in the second example, she sort of points to the cup. And in the third image, she does some kind of enactment onto the cup, right? So we can begin to describe in detail the particular forms of the hands, right? So here we have two hands, there's a lateral shapeness to it, and she appears to be holding something or shaping something. And then in this next one, she maintains the left hand configuration and then points into it. And then in the third example, also continues to maintain the left hand form, and she enacts something onto it. So the question that interests me is, why these particular forms why are they salient for her depiction? So I find that, one of the things that's interesting to talk about this is this notion of construal, which I'll get into, which is more to do with how the structure of something conveys meaning, and how the structure of something, entails as a part of the meaning making of something. So, hang on one second. Right. So I've come to construal as kind of just like a theoretical tool that allows me to look at these gestures and take them apart and look at them in detail. Now, there's a notion of construal in psychology that is related to, how something is perceived by someone, and how we interpret, how we interpret things kind of demonstrates something about how we think about them. This is sort of, it's a very perspectival and a very subjective kind of way of thinking about, for example, self-construal is this notion that if I think of myself in a particular way, such as like an individual, or if I think of myself as being part of a relationship, then I'll behave in different ways. So it's a related notion, but this is a heavily psychological notion that's rooted in these kinds of like this idea of like underlying processes or underlying beliefs manifesting in outward behavior. Another related notion to what I'm doing here is cognitive linguistics. The cognitive linguistic notion of construal. And this is related to linguistic relativity in the sense of how different grammars can change our conceptions of things. So some of you may be familiar with Slobin's and Ptolemy's ideas of, different verbs and the way that verbs in different languages can encode different information, right? And how these might manifest in gesture. Now, this is one aspect of construal. And then a more specific aspect of construal is in the structuring of the things in themselves. For example, structure has meaning, right? It's much, so it's not just like, for example, the meaning of words convey meaning, but also how we put those words together can convey meaning. So just a few examples here, how we access something in our imagination, right? So if I say my car is blue versus the car is blue, obviously we imagine different things associated with that. Likewise, if we said Jim's car, or in a particular context, if we were to address something in front of us as my car or the car, the way that we are thinking about how we access that is different based on how we put that together. There's also a sense of how interpersonal affective, valence or feelings can be construed through language as well. So, for example, something like my president versus the president. This might have emotional, the meaning of it from an emotional perspective is different. Or if you're, something like your son, if it's said by a parent, it's very strange, right? But this is sometimes this has a very impactful and meaningful emotional response, especially within troubled relationships between parents and someone. So, but to kind of give a basic definition of construal from how I'm working with it, is just simply that choices made in communication are meaningful. And like I've said at the beginning, I sort of want to get away from this idea that our communicative practices are somehow manifestations of underlying processes. I want to show how the things that we do in these communicative activities and these communicative events, this is the meaningful part of our lives and what we're doing. So, however, there is this, within construal, there is a subjective and intersubjective motivation that can be explored. For example, when we speak and we put sentences together, we may be thinking about the other person and how they might interpret what we're saying. So this is an intersubjectively motivated aspect of how we structure our sentences or our utterances. Now, construal and gesture, likewise, we make choices in the gestures that we make, even though they are quite spontaneous, and there's this debate about how spontaneous gestures are. There's definitely there's a lot of research that does show that gestures there's some kind of intention within gesturing. So gestures are changeable, they can be reshaped. We can do them in different ways. We can enact different things with gestures. And they have temporal qualities as well, right? Where we put the gesture in line with talk is meaningful and can produce specific effects of what we're talking about. And that the depictions, specifically if we're trying to, draw something in the air, those things are an achievement of specific techniques of the hands and a repertoire of the hands, possibly given by, the way that we're used to handling things. So we're used to handling things within a specific way. We're used to handling the world in different ways. Let's say, like we're used to throwing. We can throw things. We can hold things, and any number of different kinds of actions we can do with the hands. We can likewise do those actions as we're gesturing to create our depictions. In another sense of construal, there's this idea that construal is there's an interpretive function, or this like doubling up that construal does. So as I utter something verbally, the simultaneous hand gesture presents like a secondary image or a doubled image of what I'm saying, right? So if I say the word cup might, activate a certain imagination in your mind. You might imagine the cup in a certain way. But if I also depict the cup with my hands, then this may change the way you imagine it as we're speaking. So this is in a sense of construing something as something else. And this also applies to abstract concepts. So when we talk about our abstract ideas or emotions. So when I gesture along with this abstract notion, I'm giving you a form to this abstract notion. Sometimes this is called manual thinking, or this is something, or conceptual gestures, or it could be talked about as metaphorical gestures, which some people do. So one of the issues about this notion of construal, however, is if you're studying it in terms of just looking at one individual person and looking at their utterances, it's difficult to kind of get a sense of what exactly they are trying to construe, right? We can interpret that from the perspective of an analyst. We may be able to interpret it analytically, but there remains something that's left out, and this is this more intersubjective aspect of what is the motivation behind why the person is saying what they're saying, why are they saying it the way that they are, and why are they, and when it comes to gesture, depicting it in that particular way. So what we see here is, what I'm just showing you here is just that there's different ways of thinking about this notion of construal. We can think of them as, formulation, how we formulate the sentence or an utterance, and that there are certain practices involved in reaching those formulations. So, we don't just say things and depict them, but we introduce them, we contextualize them. And so those are those aspects too that we might think of as peripheral to any utterance, are actually quite important in understanding the meaning of the utterance. So to look at construal, one of the things that I've had an opportunity to look at is to see how speakers will talk about the same thing, but then change as they go along. So that was something that you have an opportunity to do, especially in the classroom setting when students are explaining different things and they're kind of put into situations where they have to demonstrate their knowledge in multiple times, in multiple ways. And so we can kind of get the sense of, okay, there is a reference, there's some kind of idea or concept that they're being asked to understand, that we're, in the classroom, we're teaching them, and then we're putting them into situations where they demonstrate that understanding of a concept. But then how do they treat that concept in those moments of re-explanation of that? So in this case, working with the corpus that I was working with at Nottingham Ningbo, it's the corpus of Chinese academic written and spoken English, had an opportunity to look at and actually participate in different tasks that we could have the students do. So one of the tasks that was actually kind of a semi-natural, semi-experimental task was involved in putting students together into groups to explain certain concepts. And we gave them a stimulus, and they were, with a diagram, and then they had to explain it to each other. As part of an extracurricular activity that they were doing as just part of the university practice overall. another corpus that I was able to look at was the group discussion. And this is also an interesting place to look at how students and how our speakers in real time will look at concepts in multiple ways, and how there will be like reformulations and reconstruals of a particular concept. So most of the examples from today will come from this first corpus. If there's time, I'll show you from the second one, but there probably won't be too much time. Okay, so let's just look at, I'm going to look at this one example first. This is this one that we looked at earlier. This is from a talk on osmosis, and the student is attempting to explain osmosis to her two peers here. Now, we already saw that she depicts the certain cups in this particular sequence, which are the cups that are involved, are the beaker and the thistle tube involved in an osmosis experiment. And she's trying to show that there is a substance within the cups, and that that substance gets mixed in a certain way. And then she tries to show the experiment. What's interesting for us is that these cups, as she's trying to depict them, there's some kind of confusion that gets mixed up, and this confusion leads to a confusion on the part of one of her peers, which in turn leads to her to repair her previous gestures. So first, let's look at this example again from what we looked at before, and we're going to be looking at the main speaker, which is Claire, the girl in the champagne jacket, and then the girl right across from her will respond and check what she's doing, check to make sure that she understands how many cups there are. So let's look at this.
I remember this. What I read is chemistry. I have a big cup. In this cup, I pour some water. This water is sugary water. Sweet water. Yes.
So you see here that as she's depicting the cups, she gets interrupted because of confusion, or just maybe some confirmation checking of what she means by sugary water, and she changes that to sweet water.
And then we put a small cup.
And we can see here that as she produces the small cup, her peer across from her also depicts that in her own way.
Yes, small cup. I put the small cup into the big cup. In the small cup, we have another sweet water.
Okay, so far so good. She's been able to depict these cups, establish that there is sweet water in the cups, and then reach a point of confirmation saying where everyone seems to be relatively satisfied with her explanation. However, later on, she depicts other aspects of the osmosis experiment, which I won't show you. But then her peer across from her wants to clarify. She wants to ask her, wait a minute, what did you depict? Let me make sure I got it right. And so she does this now. So let's look at her.
And you made a big cup and a small cup, and also a small cup. Oh, 3 cups. I have a big cup and
Okay, so here we see that in order to check her understanding, we'll call her Hua. All right, Hua is the girl in the white jacket here. She depicts 3 cups, and she says that there are 3 cups. So she makes sure to do that. But we can see, if we can examine that. Can we bring this back here? So she does 1 cup here, another cup, and then another cup. Oh no, sorry. Then this is the 3rd cup. Sorry. So this is the 1st cup, second cup, and then the 3rd cup. So there was this confusion somewhere along the line where she interpreted the gestures as there being 3 cups. Now Claire, who was the main speaker, she notices that she wipes it away. She clears the field, as if to say, okay, there's, no, let's start from the beginning again. And here she commences a repair to show that there are only 2 cups.
And another, I have another small cup.
Let me back this up here.
I have a big cup and another, I have another small cup.
So we see that how she, instead of what she originally did, which is just to have both of the cups in the same space, in the center of gesture space, she then moves it to the side to show that there's a difference between them.
I put the small cup to the big cup. Yes.
And then she creates a new enactment where she depicts the placement of the cup, of the small cup, into the big cup, which she continues to hold.
2 cups.
And then emphasizes that there are 2 cups by, you might not see it very well, but she uses her 2 fingers twice, but says 2 cups.
Okay. And
right. So then there's some more concept checking there, but we'll leave it at that. So here we see that there's a change, a slight changes in what she and her depiction lead to her, that we could say, upgrading or optimizing the explanation itself by showing that it's important that there are 2 cups and that we need to make sure that this is a salient part of the depiction. Now in the next example, she's able to explain this to a different group, and this time we can see that she integrates the repair as she's explaining this into this second group here.
This article is about chemistry of moments. If I have a big cup, in the cup we have some sweet water. Yes, and we have another small cup. In the small cup we have another sweet water. The sweet the sweet water in the small cup is more sweeter. Is sweeter than the big cup. We have 2 cups, a big cup and a small cup. In the big cup we have some sweet water, and in the big cup, and in the small cup we have another sweet water. Yes, and in the small cup, the sweet water is sweeter than the big cup. Yes, we put the small cup into the big cup with
Okay, so that was a bit of a long example to show that in the resequencing of the explanation, she has to manipulate many different aspects of the imaginary laboratory experiment with her hands, right? So we can go through this a little bit in a little bit more detail. So she initiates the depiction in the same way, using this form for the big cup, this like 2-handed lateral shape. And then the sweet water, again, is like this abstract gesture of kind of just opening her fingers in this way. I won't get too much into that right now, but here again, we see the movement to the side, right, to show that there's a different space with a different item in it, which is this small cup, right? And then going back, so now she's able to use this newly articulated difference in space to say that the big cup has more sugar in it, or is sweeter, right? And she creates this difference here. When so far as she checks understanding with her classmates, they seem to accept that what she's saying, until there's a bit of a silence, this moment of silence where that she's not sure, or they're not sure how to respond. So she takes that to mean that she should reinitiate the depiction, and does so once again, but then integrates the enactment of placement. So here is this placement of the small cup into the big cup, like that, right? And then once again, she's able to create this contrast of there's the sweet water. Now there's multiple aspects of this explanation that get changed, but the main idea here is that in order, by doing these transformations, she's narrowing the field of imaginative viewing. She's constraining the viewing of what's going on in her depiction in order for you to visualize more specifically, right? So there are lexical changes. One important lexical change is changes go from sugary water to sweet water, which allows her to then say one water is sweeter than the other, because she was having trouble with saying more sugary. So this was like a lexical aspect that allowed her to along with the contrast of the two cups, she was able to initiate that contrast in the book, in her vocabulary. And also the center location of the cups becomes changed to the displacement of cups between the big cup and small cup to really emphasize the difference between them. She profiles the difference between those two cups as being different aspects of the depiction. And then she's also able to articulate the containment relationship between the cups, so that one cup is inside the other. So initially her depiction involved just showing that in the same space, they occupy the same space. But this seems very confusing to her peers. At least she interpreted that as being the main problem. So she separated them, and then she enacts the act of putting the small cup into the big cup, as a way of kind of going through how the laboratory gets set up even before doing the osmosis experiment. And then likewise, I said that having these two spaces being articulated in the gesture space, the left space and the right space, she's then able to create a contrast also with the sweetness relation of the cups. The one is sweeter than the other. Okay, I have about 5 minutes left for another, let's see. So I probably have to wrap it up here, although my computer has just froze. Hang on one second. Oh, okay. Hang on one second. Okay. So I just have a few minutes left. So I just want to go through, we'll just look at one example from the other corpus, which is more of a task that's a collaborative discussion on a topic. So here we have 3 students who need to speak for about 9 minutes on one single topic, and they're asked to analogize, define, and take a stance on the topic. They're usually driven by a question, some kind of question or a statement. Something. In this case, the stimulus is around artificial intelligence, and will artificial intelligence take over our lives, and in what ways will they take over in our lives? So they articulate this notion of artificial intelligence as intelligent machines. They actually talk about them in terms of machines or robots in some way. So here I just want to show you how they begin to define this particular topic. So here we have the speaker in the pink, and she's going to articulate a definition of what she thinks intelligent machines means.
I think intelligent machine means that machine can work like a man, like they can react to what people's order, or they can think like a man.
So here she uses very abstract gestures to kind of, we're not quite sure what these gestures mean, but she opens her hands as she says, react like a man, they can react, and then just seems to emphasize this notion of that they are machines that listen to what people say, but that they can also think like a person. So the speaker and the discussant in the center, she initiates a paraphrase of her own to kind of clarify what she means by that, and she also includes in that paraphrase her own gestures.
If the machine can think or act like man.
Yeah.
So she initiates her paraphrase with a you mean kind of expression, initiating the clarification, and then the machine can think or act like a man, seemingly just to check her own understanding of what the previous speaker said. But she initiates her own gesture, which is this kind of swirling gesture. Oh, let me go back. Let's see.
You mean the machine can think or act like man?
So this is like looks kind of like a cyclical gesture where she's using both hands in a cyclical fashion. And then she introduces, whereas in the first example, we had this introduction of just this two hands opening up, palms up. And this one, she's adding motion to her depiction. And then, the two of them begin to collaborate in each other's paragraphing and reaching an agreement of what they mean by machines acting like human beings.
They can interact with human beings.
So this is a very quick gesture, but we can see how each of them, sort of re-articulates what they meant by human being or by intelligent machine acting like a human being. But the gestures seem to convey more of this motion of iterativity. I'll play it again.
They can interact with human beings.
Right. So the girl in pink does this iterativity by motioning forward with her palms down, and the girl in black here again with like a cyclical gesture. So this is simply to show how they can construe this notion of iterativity jointly in different ways, but together collaborating on, like, say, the analysis of what it means, of what they actually mean by an intelligent machine. So they're clarifying and participating in the concept building of the salient concept that's involved in this discussion through embodied actions, right? So it's you can call it multimodal, or we can call it embodied, saying that verbalizing and these gestures aren't quite depictive, but they're adding some kind of depictive element into the concept building that they're doing. Okay, so I'll conclude real quick. Basically, where I'm at in terms of showing how exposition and explanation, they appear, somewhat planned, but they seem more guided by moment-to-moment trajectory of utterance formulation, contingent on participant interjections, participant involvement, and the meaning of what we were talking about in an explanation is contingent on the construal, how we structure and shape the explanation, and that can change. The meaning of that explanation can change as we change the explanation. Parties in explanation, they reuse, upgrade, and refashion and restructure each other's gestures, and in doing so, reach different points of understanding of what they're talking about. Now, this isn't to say that they reach more understanding or more clear understanding. We're just looking at how these transformations kind of give new understandings of what they're talking about. Now, in construal, we can see that rather than construal being some kind of entirely subjective, perspectival imposition on speech or language, it's a publicly accountable interaction. When the way we construe something, the way we construe our utterance has impact on the interaction, how people will interpret it. Contingent on intersubjective and ecologically informed goal-directed affordances simply means that as we're thinking about how the other people will understand what we're doing, we're also thinking about what it is that we want to explain, right? We have an explanation and we want to explain it. We have a goal in mind as we do that. But as we can see in these examples, the trajectory of these explanations are highly contingent upon the interactivity of those. And this can manifest in all the different sorts of ways that we create meaning through gesture, gaze, language, and material artifacts that we bring to the discussion. So again, just to kind of reiterate this notion that our bodies are unique or interesting landscapes at our disposition to furnish new affordances for sense making. We can manipulate our bodies in ways to change in a moment by moment explanation what we want to say and what we want the other person to see in our explanation. Okay, I'll leave it at that, and so that we can have time for some questions. Thank you. Thanks to the cost team, ISGS, and to the students who had to be recorded.